Hi there and welcome to The Wrap, simple news updates for busy people. Brought to you by me, Verashni Pillay, and the team at Explain.coza. In today's edition, we discuss how the ANC must change or cede to a better way. Then there's news briefs with a prison break, South African style story, and international news, a story about girl power taking on a sexist dictator in Belarus. So, let's dive in. The ANC and the future. As emergency budgets were put aside to buy important medical supplies, corruption has mushroomed across various provinces. During his address to the State of the Nation last Thursday, President Cyril Ramaphosa vowed to crack down on the looting, but the fact is that it's happening at all paints a depressing picture of where the ANC government is at. And that's before you even factor in how it's being bossed around by teacher unions, pastors, and taxi bosses, adopting regulations in these sectors that don't make any sense. So now we have 100% capacity allowed on taxis, churches given the green light to have mass gatherings, and yet somehow public schools must stay closed altogether, all to please the party's allies and voting base, no matter how much they contradict each other. Now look, Ramaphosa is only halfway through his first term as president, and he's dealing with a once-in-a-generation crisis with a highly compromised party behind him. So while we do still have faith in him as a leader, we also hope and pray for firmer leadership of his party. However, crises create breathing room for opportunities. So now more than ever is the time for our country to get a grip, or someone or something else will. Now the New Frame, which is a left-leaning publication in South Africa, notes that this is a global moment, not just in South Africa, that exposes the failing of the current economic and political system. They write, as we face all the horrors of reality, we need an equal awareness of the seeds of a different future that are sprouting in the present. Let's hold on to a vision of a more just, equitable, and gentler society. Moving on to our big story of the week. Schools are out, but it's not that simple. President Cyril Ramaphosa's announcement on schools' closure last week has triggered a wave of criticism from some experts, the opposition party, and some members of the public. Now, the DA, who is the country's main opposition, says the move was not based on scientific evidence and is planning on taking the government to court to reverse the decision. Now, it's worth noting that the Minister of Basic Education herself, Angie Motshekga, fought to keep schools open. But it seems her arguments were sidelined by pressures from teacher unions who are primarily concerned with their members' safety. Now, to be fair, the president did say he had consulted more than 60 school, teacher, principal, and civil society organizations. And as the nation draws closer to the peak of the pandemic, closing schools does seem like a good idea from a certain perspective. But the dynamic and the consequences are complicated. For example, it means as many as 1 million children under the age of 6 are potentially being left at home unsupervised because their single mothers have to head back to work. This is according to Stellenbosch University economist Nick Spall, who was speaking to the Financial Mail. Then there's the long-term effect. Get this. These closures may weaken matric results until 2031. That's if catch-up plans are left too late or don't work properly. That's according to Martin Gustafsson, an associate professor at Stellenbosch University's economics department. Meanwhile, the president did not order that private schools must close, just public schools. So that means that private school students who are generally richer and from wealthier families will carry on as normal, and the gap between them and public school learners will get even wider. This is blatantly unfair and further entrenches inequality. Meanwhile, a number of Model C schools, technically public, have defied Ramaphosa's orders outright and are keeping their doors and classrooms open. So, what's our take? We're glad we are not the ones having to call the shots in this extremely delicate situation, but if the government chooses to keep public schools closed despite the backlash, then it needs a brilliant plan to ensure that this generation is able to catch up in the years to come, or else it truly will be left behind while children from wealthier families advance without worry. We just can't afford to widen that gap. And now, let's take a look at your news briefs for the week. Comrade Integrity passes on. So last week we told you how John Lewis, who was a giant of the civil rights movement in the United States, passed away. Just a week later, and South Africa has lost an icon of its own from its own struggle, Andrew Mlangeni. Now, along with Nelson Mandela, he was one of the famous Rivonia trialists who spent decades on Robben Island together. At 95, Mlangeni was, like Lewis, a voice for integrity. And the sad part is that he is one of the last of those Rivonia trialists to have passed away. Now, he was head of the ANC's Integrity Committee, and he was one of a few voices who stood up to former President Jacob Zuma when he was still president, demanding that Zuma resign as allegations of corruption and misgovernment mounted. Spoiler alert, Zuma did no such thing and called for Mlangeni to step down and took calls for him to step down rather as part of a Western conspiracy against him. How bizarre then that the very same Jacob Zuma led a tribute to Mlangeni at a virtual memorial on Friday, despite objections from the Mlangeni family. Thankfully, we have Mlangeni on record saying that Zuma has messed up the country, he has stolen everything. That is a direct quote from the man who people call Comrade Integrity. Mlangeni also once said, "I did not go to prison for 26 years for people to steal from the poor." Now, there were loads of obituaries about this amazing man in newspapers across the country this week, but our favorite anecdote from all of these obituaries comes from retired British High Court Judge Nick Stalden, who made a film about Mlangeni and the other lesser-known Rivonia trialists Dennis Goldberg and Amar Kathrada. He said, "These survivors of the Rivonia never tried to trade on it, cash in on their celebrity or their access to people at the top of the ANC. They all lived in extremely modest circumstances. Role models, indeed." COVID fatigue. You are not alone. We know how you feel. Millions of South Africans are in a similar boat, bored, dying for a hug, or plain just over this pandemic. Now, City Press is reporting that experts are actually quite worried about COVID fatigue and about people letting their guards down. One expert said, initially you may have felt energized and positively focused on following pandemic safety behavior. But as the virus has continued, you may start to focus on the negative and feel physically or mentally depleted. You can say that again. I'm definitely feeling that way. But remember, guys, we have to carry on washing our hands, even if it starts to look like reptile skin, and keep wearing that mask, even if it feels like it's suffocating you. South African prison break. In an episode crying out for a Netflix limited series, all 68 inmates who broke out of the Malmesbury prison in the Western Cape on Friday have been re-arrested. The prisoners allegedly overpowered officers on duty and locked 3 officers in a cell and freed other prisoners before escaping through the main entrance of the facility and over the roof. Luckily, they did not get too far. Now, it took the police 2 days to get them all behind bars, and an investigation is underway. The DA Zooming Call Conference. Now, the Democratic Alliance, again our official opposition, has voted to hold its federal Congress online on October 31 and November 1, 2020. Now, this is where the knotty problem of the party's next leader will be decided after Musi Maimane resigned under a cloud. Now, the main contenders for the position are current interim leader John Steenhuisen, who represents the Conservatives in the party, and outspoken KwaZulu-Natal MPL Mbali Ntuli, and finally John Moody. Now, neither Ntuli nor Moody were in favor of holding the leadership contest online, saying that it might disadvantage those with poor access to technology. South African teen versus Facebook Inc. Now, Facebook, like the giant corporation that it is, can seem untouchable. But this is not stopping a 13-year-old South African girl from taking on the social media giant. The family of the teenager have tried several failed legal routes to get Facebook to reveal the details of a user who sent threats of gang rape and murder via Instagram to the young girl. Now, Instagram is obviously owned by Facebook. The teenager's legal representatives navigated an international legal labyrinth, and the matter will now finally be heard this week at the Gauteng High Court. At the heart of this matter is, how does one ordinary Facebook user or Instagram user hold a faceless company like Facebook, ironically, accountable? As the lawyers said in their heads of argument, anyone who signs up to Facebook Inc. owned social media platforms, including Instagram, and who wants to obtain basic subscriber information of a person suspected of committing a crime, would face impossible hurdles. Next up is your international news. In the US, thanks to his administration's catastrophic handling of the pandemic, US President Donald Trump is lagging behind in the US presidential elections, which are less than 100 days away. Trump is now trying to fire up his conservative base by labeling ongoing Black Lives Matter and anti-police brutality protests as radical anarchy, which needs his government's firm hand to control. But it's not really convincing if the polls are anything to go by. Meanwhile, sisters are doing it for themselves. Belarus dictator Alexander Lukashenko has been in power for 25 years, and he thinks that women, poor things, and that's an actual quote, cannot lead. He has said, "Our constitution is not made for women. Our society hasn't matured to the point to vote for a woman." What nonsense. So, it's kind of awesome that 3 women are spearheading a maverick opposition campaign for next month's presidential election in the Eastern European country. And in a deadly show of efficiency, one of the women said that they hammered out the decision to unite in just a quarter of an hour. That's 15 minutes, guys. Now, the optics of the announcement also caught the public imagination. In photographs together, one of the women leaders flashed a peace sign, a second held up a fist, and the third formed her 2 hands into a heart. A surge of fan art has followed. And before we go, some practical news you need to know. If you've been forced to work from home during the COVID-19 coronavirus outbreak, like most of us have been, you may be able to claim back on your designated office space within your home, among other expenses, when you submit your next annual tax return. Woohoo! But on the flip side, you may have less to claim back if you suspended or reduced your retirement fund contributions, if you lost out on commission earnings, or if you didn't travel much for business. Boo! Either way, just a heads up to pay special attention to this year's return. On a pleasanter note, the Road Traffic Management Corporation has announced that all licenses except vehicle licenses that expired between 26th March and 31st August will now be valid until the end of January 2021. Now that's a relief if your license is expiring in that time. So that's it from us at The Wrap, a product of explain.coza, simple news summaries for busy people. Now remember to share the love. Tell your friends to sign up for the updates at explain.coza/subscribe. Till next time, goodbye from me, Verashni, and the rest of the explain.coza team.